In the earlier days, one of the things you always heard was that social workers were just implementing really bad government policy. But then you see someone like Bridget Moran and you realize that there's such a breadth to social work and what we can contribute.
Bridget had the courage to step out and say what she was thinking.
She had no fear writing letters, going to the Premier, challenging administrations in any level.
Mum ended up with lots and lots of media attention, and she did become a bit of a folk hero.
The University of Northern British Columbia is proud today to honor Bridget Moran, who is that rarest of authors, one who chooses to write of Northern people from a Northern perspective.
Before I met Bridget, I read Little Rebellion and thought, yes, this is a woman who really walks the walk, not just talks the talk. And that's the kind of social worker I want to be.
Prince George was a good place to grow up. It was booming, you know, in the 60s. And there was always lots going on in our family, in the community. Mum was involved in the peace movement. I remember peace marches in the 60s, political campaigns. We were always involved in any of the campaigns that happened. And yeah, it was a fun household with lots of humor and lots of people coming in and out and some great parties.
Prince George was the largest centre in the north, and it still is. I think that this is a bit of a melting pot of all kinds of people, but certainly of Indigenous cultures and people. I'm not sure exactly what the population would have been back in the 60s and 70s, but I know at this juncture it's about 10%. I think it's really important to remember it was a different world then. Politicians didn't see that Indigenous people mattered and that they could become a force, which they have become today. In the middle 60s, there was lots of racism.
I was very engaged in working, for example, in downtown Vancouver in some of the housing complexes there with young mums who were losing their kids, right?
So often, you know, people say, oh yeah, kids, you know, need to be safe, and you have a group home, but I don't want it in my neighborhood.
Mum was offered a job as a social worker, and at that time I think there was a spirit of real energy, but the W.A.C. Bennett government that came in '52 didn't really have a priority on doing anything but building the province, and I think there was a real feeling of discrimination about people on welfare, and Mum really felt the effects of that over time.
The response of the government was to say that we are opening up the province in terms of highways and hydro dams and physical infrastructure for the province, but that as far as the social infrastructure, that was not their responsibility. That sense of if you just work hard enough, anybody can make it, without looking at the kinds of circumstances that people find themselves in, whether it's, you know, what happened with Indigenous peoples in terms of residential schools and the consequences of that.
I think a lot of the general public of those days weren't aware that economic development has to go hand in hand with social development. And so if we're going to develop resources in our area, we have to make sure there's housing for everybody.
Bridget was constantly the person who would advocate for these families, saying that all families need to have a living that is on poverty level, that kids need to be safe, women need to be safe.
And they tried. They asked for more resources. They explained what things they needed, but nothing changed.
I can see where your frustration would have boiled over with not being able to do what she would hoped for a family and for children. And I even remember in those days there was judgments about children that being cared for by their grandparents.
One of the things you always heard was that social workers were just implementing really bad government policy. And where was the role to try and change it?
There was one case, there was a young Indigenous girl whose life had gone sideways for reasons that she had no control over. Mom and the parents and others could see that the girl was in crisis. She was 13 years old, I think, at the time, going into the Willingdon School, which was a reform school, and it was basically like jail for young people. But the system provided absolutely no support for young people who had mental health issues. And Mom, after trying every which way, she'd had enough. She wrote an open letter to the Premier of the province and sent it to all of the media. And I don't think had any real sense of what was going to happen as a result of that. It became a huge issue. Ended up with lots and lots of media attention, and it kind of broke apart lots of the other issues that were going on in the lack of support for people who were living in poverty and needed help, and mental health issues and also poverty issues. So I think it had a huge impact, and she had no sense that that was what was going to happen. She was fired, and then she was basically blacklisted. I mean, she was never again hired by the provincial government to work as a social worker, and that was certainly a career that she had loved.
She did an extraordinary thing in those times when it was probably better just to keep quiet, to keep your job. She stepped out and said, "This isn't okay."
She just had such great self-esteem herself that she just said, "Screw it. I am just going to do what I need to do, and I don't care what other people think. And if people don't agree with me, too bad."
She persevered, and she'd been a lifelong writer and communicator. And so I think that that's her natural inclination to communicate what was happening. That kind of propelled her on. The social work community, the social justice communities at the time got in touch with her. She kind of developed links across the province and the country. She was just so much a part of something bigger at that point that it really became a huge part of her life from then on. I mean, I never got the sense from her that she ever considered retreating, just shutting the world out and saying, "Okay, I need some me time." That just didn't happen. She had a lot of support, I think, from my dad and from friends. And, in those days, I just think probably didn't even have time to stop and think too much about it. I mean, 4 kids, and we were all young. I can't imagine that it was anything but incredibly hard. Mom's first book, Stony Creek Woman, that was the first book that she had published, and Mary John wanted Mom to tell her story.
In 1976, that's when I first met Mary, and I met her daughter, Helen Jones, and she asked me if I would write the story of her mother. She felt that her mother's story should be told.
So I guess Auntie Helen had wanted Granny to share her story. She wanted it documented, and Granny's like, "No," right? Which doesn't surprise you. And then she goes, "Do it for the family. Like, do it for the family. If we just have, that would be our history written down." And then, so I think that was the way that she's like, "Okay, I'll entertain that."
So what I did was take my little motorhome and go out in the reserve, usually when the fish were running. I tried to arrange that. And we set up a tape recorder, and she did her beadwork, and I knit, and we talked, and that's where I got material for the book.
Tell us a bit about who Mary John is.
Well, Mary's mother had Mary when she was 13 years old. Mary's mother's name was Enzel. When Mary was about 4 or 5, her mother married Johnny Paul, and she went to Stony Creek Reserve. She went to LeJac School, and I think my book goes into a fair amount of detail of what it was like to go to an Indian residential school. She was 16 years old when she was married. She had 12 children, none of them born in hospital. They were all born on trap lines or in the village of Stony Creek or what have you.
Mom and Mary John, they really had a connection. It was lovely to watch. I think they were 2 women who both had a great sense of humor and loved to chat. But I also think they both kind of understood that there was an important story to be told.
I think having Granny's story documented is such a gift. Like, bless you, Auntie Helen.
I think for Mary John, she wasn't looking for fame at all, but her story was an exceptional story in many ways that really hadn't been told much. But that was 30 years ago. We now live in a time of truth and reconciliation and more awareness, and Indigenous people are telling their own stories and are doing an incredibly amazing job of it. But in 1987, 88, there wasn't very many stories like Mary John's out there.
She really was ahead of her time, yeah. And it was a huge loss. But she's left such a legacy for us all.
If you think about the people you remember in your life, it's not the people who just went along. It's the people who stepped out and did something extraordinary. And that's what Bridget did.
I think Bridget and many others provide a glimpse of how we can make our contribution so that when people look back and think about what did these guys do to deal with the problems that they faced, that they'll be able to say, hey, they actually did move society forward for us.
I think she'd probably be pretty pleased now that there's more awareness and more talk about some of the issues. But I think she'd still be writing letters to the papers. She'd still be pushing any government that was in to do more and to do it faster. She'd be just as vocal as ever.
I wish that everybody could embody who she was and the values that she had. So, but a bit of idealism there.